Ever notice how something as simple as, flicking on a light switch can suddenly get all tangled up in global politics?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's exactly what we're dealing with today.
Yeah.
Ontario just hit the U.S. with a pretty surprising move, a brand new 25% surcharge on all the electricity it sends south of the border.
Yeah, this whole thing really underscores how interconnected everything is these days.
Absolutely. And we've got a ton to unpack to understand all of this.
Well, yeah, we've got a whole stack of stuff here.
Yeah.
News reports, government briefings, even some FAQs.
Yeah.
People are scrambling, trying to figure out what this all means.
So for you, our listener, today's deep dive is all about getting to the bottom of this. We want to find out why Ontario decided to do this, who's going to feel the pinch, and what this whole thing says about the bigger picture of trade between the U.S. and Canada.
Right.
We're not just skimming the surface here.
Okay.
We're going deep.
We're digging deep.
So to really grasp why this is happening right now, we have to go back to the beginning.
Yeah.
This electricity surcharge, this isn't some random event.
No.
This is a direct response to something the U.S. did.
It's a reaction to the 25% tariffs that the U.S. under the Trump administration recently slapped on certain Canadian imports.
Okay, so it's basically a tit for tat.
Yeah, it seems that way.
And Ontario's countermove, which officially began on Monday, March 10th of this year, 2025, is this 25% surcharge specifically aimed at the electricity they export to the U.S.
Right.
Now, the way this works is there's a $10 per megawatt-hour charge tacked on.
Okay.
Now, a megawatt-hour, just to give you an idea, is a serious chunk of power.
Yeah.
We're talking enough to keep hundreds of homes running for an hour.
Wow.
And that $10 surcharge equals out to about 25% of the average value of that electricity.
Right.
So this isn't small potatoes.
Not at all.
And it's not hitting every U.S. state.
No, it's not.
It's laser focused on Michigan, Minnesota, and New York.
Right.
These are the states that directly get electricity from Ontario.
They're on the front lines of this.
Now, the potential cost here is pretty staggering. We're talking up to 400,000 Canadian dollars each day.
Wow.
And that's roughly 277,000 U.S. dollars.
That's a big chunk of change.
And this could impact something like 1.5 million homes and businesses across those three states.
So that begs the question, where's all this extra money going?
That's a good question.
What's Ontario planning to do with this revenue?
Well, Ontario has said that the money from this surcharge will be used to support their own workers' families and businesses.
Okay.
So they're presenting it as a way to soften the blow from those U.S. tariffs.
Right. Kind of a shield for their own economy.
Now let's talk about Premier Doug Ford. He has not been quiet about how he feels about these U.S. tariffs.
No, he hasn't.
He's used some pretty strong words.
Yeah, the sources we've got here quote him calling it an existential threat to Ontario's economy.
Yeah.
He's even used terms like mass chaos and economic war.
Yeah. He's definitely not mincing words.
No, not at all.
He sees this as a major escalation.
And what's really striking is that he's not just stopping at this surcharge.
Yeah.
He's made it clear that he might increase it.
Right.
Or even completely cut off electricity exports if the U.S. decides to push those tariffs even higher.
Yeah, he's basically saying he's got this lever and he's willing to pull it.
Exactly. A very powerful bargaining chip.
And he's not impressed by the 1-month pause on some of the tariffs that the U.S. offered.
Right. He's basically dismissed that as just creating more uncertainty.
Yeah, and he makes a valid point. He points out that the majority of goods, something like 60%, are still facing those tariffs.
Yeah, so from his perspective, the core issue hasn't been addressed.
Exactly.
And to give you a sense of the impact on American consumers, Premier Ford estimates this surcharge could tack on roughly 100 Canadian dollars.
Wow.
Or about 69 U.S. dollars to their monthly electricity bills.
Yeah, that's a number that'll definitely get people's attention.
No doubt about it.
Yeah. Okay, so how are the states that are actually being hit by this reacting? Let's start with Minnesota.
Yeah.
Governor Walz initially expressed concern about this, the potential for Minnesotans to see skyrocketing electric bills.
Right. Understandable worry.
But when we look at Minnesota Power, a major energy provider in the state, they have a different take.
They do. They believe that the impact on their customers will probably be negligible.
Huh.
They pointed out that they don't actually rely that heavily on electricity from Ontario last year. It was only about $300,000 worth over 4 months.
Okay.
And they also highlighted that they rely more on Manitoba Hydro, which isn't affected by this Ontario surcharge.
So you're saying that the overall impact might really vary depending on the energy mix and where each provider gets their electricity?
Exactly. Different areas might feel it more or less depending on their specific circumstances.
Makes sense. What about New York? What's their take on all of this?
Well, New York's grid operator and WISO, the folks responsible for managing the flow of electricity throughout the state. They've said that they're doing everything they can to ensure stable flows of electricity.
Okay.
And they expect to have adequate reserves.
Okay.
What's interesting is they also mentioned some early confusion about whether these U.S. tariffs would even apply to electricity in the first place.
Huh. So they weren't even sure at first.
Well, it sounds like there was some initial uncertainty on their end about how far the U.S. actions would reach.
Interesting. All right, last but not least, what are we hearing from Michigan?
The Michigan Public Service Commission has voiced concerns about this surcharge. They're worried about the impact on pricing and reliability for their electricity supply.
Okay, makes sense.
However, similar to Minnesota Power's take, they believe that the final impact on customers is likely to be small.
So again, we're seeing this theme of initial concern, but maybe the actual reliance on Ontario's electricity isn't enough to cause huge disruptions.
Right. It seems that way.
It's really fascinating to see these different reactions from the states.
It is.
Now, we also heard from Representative Tom Emmer from Minnesota. He has a different perspective altogether. He suggests that this move by Ontario could backfire.
Really?
And actually strengthen President Trump's position.
Hello?
Because it lets Trump frame this as him standing up for America against foreign retaliation.
Oh, I see. So a political play.
Exactly.
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes an action that's meant to be defensive economically can have unintended political consequences.
For sure.
It can shift public opinion, rally people around the flag, and even make negotiations tougher.
Absolutely.
So it's a complex web of effects.
Okay, so let's bring in some expertise from the energy market.
Sure.
We've got Rebecca Lamas, an analyst with Wood Mackenzie.
Yeah.
And she suggests that the immediate impact on electricity prices, those real-time prices, might be limited.
Interesting. Why is that?
Well, she points to a few key things.
Okay.
First, there's still some uncertainty about exactly how the surcharge is going to be implemented. You know, the nuts and bolts of how the independent system operators will collect and pay it all out. That's not totally clear yet.
All right, so some logistical wrinkles to iron out.
Exactly.
Okay, what's the other factor?
The weather has been pretty mild lately.
Two.
And that tends to keep electricity demand and therefore prices pretty stable.
Right, less strain on the system.
So consumers might not feel the surcharge immediately in their bills.
Makes sense.
But she does say that if things become more clear, implementation-wise,
Yeah.
and if the weather changes, the longer-term impact on prices could definitely shift.
So a wait-and-see situation for now.
Yeah, for now.
But this surcharge is clearly another piece of the puzzle in this whole U.S.-Canada trade relationship.
So, absolutely.
It's really important to remember how closely linked our energy systems are.
Yeah.
The U.S. is Canada's only electricity trading partner.
Right.
And our grids are incredibly integrated.
Yeah, we share a lot of infrastructure.
Back in 2023, the net flow of electricity from Canada to the U.S. was a whopping 27.6 terawatt hours.
Oh.
And Ontario was a major part of that, along with Manitoba, British Columbia, and Quebec.
So this isn't some isolated incident.
Not at all. It's happening within this really intertwined energy market.
And let's not forget, this electricity surcharge isn't happening in a vacuum.
Right.
Canada already has retaliatory tariffs in place on something like 30 billion Canadian dollars worth of U.S. goods.
Yeah, so we're adding another layer of complexity to an already tense trade situation.
Exactly. And we can't ignore the broader economic effects.
No, we can't.
We saw the Dow Jones take a big hit on Monday, down over 2%.
Right.
That's often a sign that investors are getting nervous about trade wars and how they could affect corporate profits and economic growth.
Makes sense. They don't like uncertainty.
And we're also seeing surveys that show U.S. households are feeling more and more pessimistic about their financial futures.
Yeah, these trade actions have very real consequences. They ripple out across all sorts of sectors.
Absolutely. All right, let's get into the nitty-gritty of how this surcharge actually works.
Okay.
Who pays what, where?
Well, the surcharge itself is applied by the Canadian electricity sellers right when the power leaves Canada.
At the border, basically.
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay, but who actually foots the bill on the U.S. side?
That can vary depending on the contracts that are in place.
Okay.
It could be the independent system operator managing the grid, or a specific utility company, or someone else who has a direct deal with those Ontario generators.
Okay.
It's not necessarily a straight shot to individual consumers' bills right away. It happens at that intermediary wholesale level.
So business to business at first.
Yeah, think of it like a tax added when the electricity crosses the border.
Okay, that makes sense. So looking ahead, what are the possible long-term impacts of all of this?
Well, to be honest, the future is uncertain.
Of course.
Predicting how trade disputes will play out over time is always a challenge.
Yeah, way too many moving parts.
But the possibility of things escalating is definitely there, especially with Premier Ford being so clear that he's willing to crank up that surcharge or even stop exports completely if the U.S. keeps pushing with the tariffs.
Right. He's not bluffing.
It seems that way.
And we've also heard that Quebec might be thinking about similar actions with their own electricity exports.
Wow.
So that could widen the impact even further.
It could.
And really strain the relationship between the U.S. and Canada.
For sure. And the fact that we're using essential infrastructure like the electricity grid as a weapon in this trade war,
Yeah.
that raises some big questions about how stable and predictable energy supplies and costs will be going forward.
Right. Oh, okay. So for you, our listener, here's the bottom line.
Okay.
Ontario's new electricity surcharge is a huge deal.
It is.
It's a direct response to these trade tensions with the U.S.
Right.
And it shows they're willing to use even vital infrastructure in this fight.
Right. They're not holding back.
It highlights just how interconnected our economies are.
Yeah, and it really makes you think about the long-term consequences. What happens when we start using things like shared electricity grids as tools in international trade battles?
Right? Is this a sign of things to come?
Could this set a precedent for future conflicts?
And what does that mean for how reliable and affordable essential resources will be, not just between the U.S. and Canada, but globally?
These are big questions.
Huge.
And it's worth thinking about how these trade decisions made at such a high level could trickle down and affect our daily lives and the overall economic landscape.
Absolutely. So much to think about.
Yeah, it's a complex situation with far-reaching implications.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We'll be back soon to tackle another complex issue.
Right. Always something new to unpack.
Until then, stay curious.
And stay informed.